Welcome to Module 2. Module 2 treats the nature and effects of virtual rent and costs in use. Now, let's begin with virtual rent. What is virtual rent? Virtual rent, or sitting rent as some people call it, is the annual equivalent (AE) cost of occupation of property to the occupier in cases where capital has been paid out in lieu or in addition to rent. That means in most cases you are trying to determine the cost of the occupation to you as the tenant. That is why you want to calculate virtual rent in most cases. So you want to find the annual cost of your occupation in respect of a particular property, maybe for comparison sake or for decision making sake. You just want to know, or for appraisal sake. So virtual rent is equal to net rent paid per annum plus the annual equivalent of any premium that you have paid at the beginning of the lease, or cost of work that you are expected to do as a tenant. So you try to break the two components down. That is, if it is a premium or cost of works that you have done as per agreement with the landlord, and you are trying to break it down to knowing the cost in occupation. Then what is annual equivalent? Annual equivalent simply means any premium or cost of work done which you have incurred at the beginning of your lease times annuity ₦1 we purchase. So it means premium paid at the beginning or cost of work done which you have agreed with the landlord. Then you break it down, you read. Welcome to Module 2. Module 2 treats the nature and effects of virtual rent and costs in use. Now, let's begin with virtual rent. What is virtual rent? Virtual rent, or sitting rent as some people call it, is the annual equivalent (AE) cost of occupation of property to the occupier in cases where capital has been paid out in lieu or in addition to rent. That means in most cases you are trying to determine the cost of the occupation to you as the tenant. That is why you want to calculate virtual rent in most cases. So you want to find the annual cost of your occupation in respect of a particular property, maybe for comparison sake or for decision making sake. You just want to know, or for appraisal sake. So virtual rent is equal to net rent paid per annum plus the annual equivalent of any premium that you have paid at the beginning of the lease, or cost of work that you are expected to do as a tenant. So you try to break the two components down. That is, if it is a premium or cost of works that you have done as per agreement with the landlord, and you are trying to break it down to knowing the cost in occupation. Then what is annual equivalent? Annual equivalent simply means any premium or cost of work done which you have incurred at the beginning of your lease times annuity ₦1 we purchase. So it means premium paid at the beginning or cost of work done which you have agreed with the landlord. Then you break it down, you reduce it to an annual cost. And what you do, the way to reduce is to multiply by annuity ₦1 we purchase. You will remember from the lower classes that annuity 1 naira we purchase is equal to I plus S. That is interest plus provision for sinking fund. Premium or cost of work done C, or you can divide by YP. Since annuity is 1 over YP, 1 over IS, that is annuity. Now the capital expenditure covered in this calculation, which a lessee is going to make, can take the following forms. Can be premium paid at the beginning of the lease, as I have mentioned before, or it can be alterations, cost of work done, which includes alterations, improvement, and other capital works done to the property itself. These are only covered by your calculation. So you can base your calculation on the premium and cost of work done, or cost of work done and cost of work done, or cost of work done, and break it down to an annual equivalent figure, which you eventually add to the net rent paid to get the virtual rent. This is the basis of virtual rent. So let's look at a worked example. Worked example 1. A prospective lessee has had an offer of a FRI lease of shop for 21 years at a rent of 100,000 naira per annum. It means that rent is net rent because it's FRI, full repairing and insuring. A premium was 500,000 having been paid on entry. Before signing the lease, he wishes to know what will be his virtual rent during the term. If the lessee has to spend 400,000 on improvement to the property in 5 years' time, what is his virtual rent? What is the virtual rent or sitting rent or the lease? Then if you look at the solution on your right side, you will see that rent receivable is on the net basis, as I've said, because FRI 100,000, premium payable is 500,000. So you have to deconstruct the premium to an annual equivalent, and that's by dividing it by YP. The premium is supposed to run for 21 years that he paid already on entry. So divided by YP 21 years at the appropriate market yield. Since it's lessee, it must be on the dual rate, tax at 40 as usual. Then that gives you 7.5120. Annual equivalent of the premium will be 66,560. Then an improvement is also to be made in 5 years' time, I suppose, and that has been agreed. So what you will have is 21 years minus 5 years, because it's not going to do it today, it's going to do it in 5 years' time. So your YP will only run for 16 years and also at the dual rate. So you have cost of improvement 400,000 divided by, because you want to find the annual equivalent, you either multiply by annuity or divide by YP, whichever pleases you or whichever is appropriate. Cost of improvement 400,000 divided by YP, 16 years at 7.5, tax at 40, that's 6.34. Annual equivalent of the cost of improvement will be 63,000. Then the virtual rent per annum will then be the addition of 100,000, 66,000, 560, 63,090, which will be 229,650. You will notice that there is no deferment of the premium payable at a future date. Premium paid on entry is accounted for. Premiums payable at future dates are ignored. Please take note of those things. Premium payable at a future date are ignored. There is no deferment on the premium payable at a future date. We did not defer it because it was payable, because that premium was was because in fact there was no premium payable at a future date. It was just, except you want to regard the cost of improvement as a premium, something like that. He paid a premium on entry, and that was discounted for the purpose of getting the annual equivalent. But just let's take a note of all these things. There is no deferment of the premium payable at a future date. From this question, no premium is payable at a future date. Premium paid on entry is accounted for because it has to run for 21 years, and so we have to find the annual equivalent. Premium payable at the future date are ignored. They don't even occur in this question. In the light of the previous worked example 1, I want you to look at this work example 2 and deconstruct it, rework it, and check your answers with the solution that is provided on the right hand side. This is for you to work it out on yourself, by yourself. Slide 4 is just trying to compare virtual rent with rental value. Virtual rent will often exceed the rental value for two major reasons. It may also be lower. It depends on the market response to the virtual rent. For example, if the cost inputs were not properly related to market demands, then it will not result into any increase or increases that will be remarkable, that will make the virtual rent differ significantly from the rental value, or the rental values differ significantly from the virtual rent. So increases are governed by willingness and ability of tenants to pay higher rent for improved accommodation. So where the market is unable to respond to the improvement, there may be no increase in rental value, and the computed virtual rent remains higher. In other words, if, for instance, before you do your works, you did not consider it properly that it will improve the rental value, then after you have expended cost on the works, there will be no increase in the rental value. So the virtual rent remains higher. Then secondly, increase in rental value may, in the absence of special information, be estimated on the basis of simple interest on capital sum expended, whereas virtual rent is based on compound interest theory with the provision of sinking fund to replace the sum expended by the end of the lessee term. So this has to do with simple and compound interest, whereas the theory of interest rate is based on compound interest, whereas the estimation may have been done on the basis of simple interest. However, in general, if the annual equivalent of a premium or capital expenditure is found and added to the rent reserve, the result is expected to represent a fair rental value of the premises. That is, ordinarily, there should be no difference between rental value and virtual rent. This is not often the case, based on the explanation I have given. It depends on the market response and how well it is calculated before the expenditures are undertaken. Now we get into costs in use. Cost in use is synonymous with life cycle costing, and what cost in use does is different from virtual rent. Virtual rent looks at the annual cost of occupation of a property by a lessee. So it presupposes that virtual rent is tenant based. largely and to a very large extent. Whereas cost in use looks at the annual cost in use, or the present value of all costs over the life of a building. They are different, although their purposes may overlap at some points. They can be used for comparison too, on the basis of tenants and even investors trying to compare. One is trying to compare the annual cost of his occupation. The other one is trying to compare the cost in use over the entire lifespan of the building. So cost in use is a single sum, just like the virtual rent. After you have added it to the net rent, becomes a single sum. Cost in use is also a single sum, which is the annual cost in use or the present value of all costs over the life of a building. While the building is there and you are using it, because utility determines the value of a building really, so you constantly use it, but you have to run maintenance costs. There are running costs and maintenance costs involved, and it could also be for part of a building, not necessarily for the whole building. It could also be done for investment analysis purpose on part of the building or the entire building. But for the purpose of our study, let's limit it to the entire building first. And you now reduce to a common measure for you to be able to unify a figure around some comparative measures that can help you to take a decision as to whether the cost in use of scheme A is lower or higher than those of schemes B and C. So all the necessary costs are added together, and annual cost in use can be determined at today's value, because that's why you need to find the present value at today's value of all the costs, if it were possible. But that constitutes a limiting factor to this analysis, the possibility of getting all possible costs over the life of the building. But that is what is required anyway. So total cost in use, you are talking about, if you want to determine that, you are talking about the total building cost plus present value of all annual running and maintenance costs over the economic life of the building, which is often taken as 50 years. So it means you must have the benefit of the hindsight to be able to determine all these costs over this period and PV them according to the waiting period. That is for total. For annual cost in use, it is total building cost plus PV of all the running and maintenance costs over the economic life of the building multiplied by the annuity, because annuity now brings it to the annual cost in use. It's the same annuity we talked about before, which is 1 over YP, 1 over I plus S. YP is 1 over I plus S. So if annuity is 1 over YP, it means annuity is 1 over I plus S. So when you break it down, you come to I plus S. So the technique is used, the technique of cost in use, whether annual or total, is used for comparison of costs of different designs. You could have different schemes having different designs or different use of materials, which will generate different costs, and constructional techniques, which will generate different costs, which you can then use for investment ranking. You can then say investment A is better than B, B is better than C, and take a decision then for decision making as well. So this is the whole key to cost in use. Depends on whether you are looking for total cost in use or annual cost in use, but the approach is almost the same, other than the multiplication with annuity, #1 purchase. It is desirable that when you are calculating your rate of interest, the rate of interest will be used for PV, annuity #1 with purchase, and even YP. You take this small formula into consideration. R is equals to 1 plus D over 1 plus I minus 1, because you have to factor in cost of borrowing and the inflation rate to be able to get a discount rate in which you use for either the annuity, the present value, or YP, as the case may be. That is the requirement. The inflation rate is high, then D is the what now? Cost of borrowing. Cost of borrowing is D. The inflation rate is high. So if we assume that the cost of borrowing is 22%, we have to know what the cost of borrowing is, and the inflation rate in Nigeria is 12%. We have to find out what the current rates are, cost of borrowing, and the inflation rate. Then we are trying to calculate R. Our R will be 1 plus 0.22 over 1 plus 0.12 minus 1. So our R will be 9%. So this is the basis of the calculation of the discount rate for application to PV, annuity, and even the YP rate we are going to use. So they are interwoven, because it will have to do with maintenance rate, construction, and all that. So it's a way of factoring all these inputs to be able to get a reliable discount rate. So we should never forget that small formula. R is equal to 1 plus D over 1 plus I minus 1, because that is the basis of your R. You must show that you have factored in the cost of borrowing and inflation rates to make it robust. Hello, this is just a simple process that can help you facilitate the valuation of cost in use. You can follow the process if you find it comfortable, convenient. First, determine the initial construction cost. Mind you, you are looking for the annual cost in use, yeah? So then determine all running costs and maintenance costs for all the items from year to year for the entire life of the building. That is not going to be easy, as one of the problems posed by this cost in use approach. Then find the PV for all the running and maintenance costs from year to year for the entire life of the building. Sum up 1 to 3, 1 and 3, that is determine add the initial constructional cost to all running and maintenance costs. You have to do the addition. Then find the PV of both, of all running costs, everything. After you have summed 1 and 3, then determine the annual equivalent of 4 above of the summation. And you can do this either by multiplying with the annuity #1 with purchase at R, which you have determined with 1 plus with that little formula I mentioned before, 1 plus I over 1 plus R, 1 plus D over 1 plus I minus 1. That's how you are supposed to determine the R. Then you multiply by that, or by dividing with YP in PEP at the same R which you have determined, or YP for the entire term if it's for the unexpired term if it's a leaseholder. The resultant figure will give you the annual cost in use. That's just a simple valuation process that has been provided to guide you in getting over any exercise in this cost in use, depending on whether you are trying to find the total cost in use. If you are trying to find the total cost in use, you don't have to add the initial construction cost. You don't have to. You will add the initial construction cost, but you don't have to find the annual equivalent of the initial construction cost. But you will find the annual equivalent of other ones. So when you add, you will get the total cost in use. But if you are trying to find the annual, you bring everything to annual.